famous pianist jokingly asked a black maid to play the piano. What she did next astounded everyone. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Pemberton mansion, its light catching the diamonds adorning the necks of society's most elite. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the soft murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by the gentle clink of champagne glasses. This was the kind of gathering where million-dollar business deals were sealed with handshakes and political careers were made or destroyed with a whispered word. At the center of it all stood the magnificent Steinway grand piano, its ebony surface gleaming like a black mirror. And beside it, commanding the attention of every guest in the opulent ballroom, was Vincent Ashworth, the most celebrated pianist of his generation. Vincent's fingers danced across the keys with practiced elegance, weaving Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 into the evening air. His performance was flawless, each note crisp and precise, delivered with the kind of technical mastery that had earned him international acclaim. The guests stood transfixed, their conversations forgotten as they watched the maestro at work. "Magnificent, simply magnificent," whispered Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the evening's hostess, to the oil baron standing beside her. "Vincent truly is a gift from heaven." The businessman nodded, mesmerized. "I heard he charges $50,000 just for a private performance like this." "Worth every penny." Vincent's reputation preceded him everywhere. At 35, he had already performed at Carnegie Hall 17 times, recorded 12 platinum albums, and commanded fees that made grown men weep. His concerts sold out within minutes, his albums topped classical charts for months, and his mere presence at an event elevated its status from exclusive to legendary. As the final notes of the concerto faded into appreciative silence, thunderous applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Vincent rose gracefully, his perfectly tailored tuxedo immaculate despite the passionate performance. He bowed with practiced humility, though his eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of yet another conquered audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Pemberton announced, her voice carrying across the room, "let's give our dear Vincent another round of applause. Truly, we are witnessing greatness tonight." Vincent smiled, basking in the adoration. This was his world, a place where his talent opened every door, where his name commanded respect, where he stood above ordinary mortals. He lived for these moments, when hundreds of eyes gazed upon him with wonder and envy. But as he acknowledged the applause, his attention was caught by a movement in the corner of his eye. There, near the towering windows that overlooked the mansion's manicured gardens, a figure moved quietly between the guests, collecting empty glasses and straightening cushions with invisible efficiency. It was the maid, a black woman who appeared to be in her 40s, though her face held a timeless quality that made her age difficult to determine. She wore the standard uniform of the Pemberton household staff, a simple black dress with a white apron, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. Most guests barely registered her presence, treating her as part of the furniture, but something about her caught Vincent's attention. Perhaps it was the way she moved, not with the hurried, subservient shuffle one might expect, but with a quiet grace that seemed almost musical. Or maybe it was how her eyes had lingered on the piano during his performance, not with the blank stare of someone simply doing their job, but with something deeper. Something that looked almost like longing? Vincent's curiosity was piqued, but more than that, he sensed an opportunity for entertainment. The evening's formal performances were concluded, but the night was young, and his audience was still hungry for spectacle. What better way to extend his moment in the spotlight than with a bit of harmless fun at the expense of the help? He cleared his throat, and the conversations gradually died down as all attention returned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice carrying the confident timbre that had charmed audiences worldwide. "I hope you've enjoyed tonight's musical selections." Another round of enthusiastic applause filled the room. "But you know," Vincent continued, his eyes finding the maid as she quietly worked near the back of the room, "music should be for everyone, shouldn't it? After all, we're all human beings with souls that can appreciate beauty." Some guests nodded politely, though they seemed puzzled about where this was heading. Vincent's smile widened as he gestured toward the maid. "You there, miss?" "Yes, you with the tray." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and gradually, all heads turned to follow his gaze. The maid froze, a crystal glass halfway to her tray. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, suddenly thrust into the glare of dozens of curious, expectant faces. "What's your name, my dear?" Vincent asked, his tone dripping with condescension disguised as kindness. "Sarah, sir," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah? What a lovely name!" Vincent's voice boomed across the silent ballroom. "Tell me, Sarah, do you enjoy music?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Sarah glanced around the room, acutely aware that every pair of eyes was now fixed upon her. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully. Vincent clapped his hands together with theatrical delight. "Wonderful! You know what, Sarah? Since we're all here celebrating the beauty of music, why don't you come over here and give our beautiful piano a try? I'm sure our gracious guests would love to hear what you can do." A ripple of nervous laughter swept through the crowd. This was clearly meant to be entertainment, the kind of awkward spectacle that would provide amusing stories to share at future dinner parties. The idea of the maid attempting to play after witnessing Vincent's masterful performance was deliciously absurd. "Oh, Vincent, you're terrible," giggled Mrs. Pemberton, though her eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Come now," Vincent insisted, his voice taking on a more commanding tone disguised as encouragement. "Don't be shy. Music is the universal language, after all. I'm sure you must know Mary Had a Little Lamb or perhaps Happy Birthday." More laughter erupted from the guests. Someone near the back called out, "This should be good," while others whispered among themselves, already composing the story they'd tell about the evening when the maid tried to play piano. Sarah remained frozen in place, the crystal glass trembling slightly in her hand. Her eyes darted toward the exit, clearly calculating whether she could escape this humiliating situation. But there was nowhere to run. She was trapped in the center of a spotlight she never wanted, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than evening's entertainment. "Come now, don't keep us waiting," Vincent pressed, his smile never wavering though his eyes had taken on a harder edge. "It's just for fun. What could go wrong?" For a long moment, Sarah stood perfectly still, and Vincent wondered if she might actually refuse. That would be disappointing. He'd have to find another way to amuse his audience. But then something shifted in her expression. The fear and uncertainty didn't disappear, but something else joined it. Something that looked almost like determination? Slowly, Sarah set down her tray on a nearby table. The soft clink of crystal against marble seemed to echo through the suddenly silent ballroom. Every guest held their breath as she began to walk toward the piano, her steps measured and deliberate. Vincent's smile broadened. This was going to be even better than he'd hoped. The anticipation in the room was electric. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable embarrassment, the fumbled notes, the confirmation that some people simply knew their place in the world. As Sarah approached the piano bench, Vincent graciously stepped aside with an exaggerated bow. "The stage is yours, my dear," he announced with mock gallantry. Sarah paused at the bench, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface. For a moment she simply stood there, and Vincent wondered if she was going to lose her nerve after all. But then she looked up, and he was startled by what he saw in her eyes. Gone was the frightened, uncertain woman who had been cornered by his cruel joke. Instead, he saw something that sent an unexpected chill down his spine, a quiet fire, a determination that seemed to burn from somewhere deep within her soul. Her eyes held secrets, stories, and something that looked almost like recognition. She sat down at the bench with a grace that seemed to transform her entirely. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, and suddenly she no longer looked like a maid who had been thrust into an uncomfortable situation. She looked like someone who belonged at that piano. The room fell into absolute silence. Every guest leaned forward slightly, waiting for the inevitable disaster. Vincent himself felt a strange flutter of unease, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Sarah's hands hovered over the keys for just a moment, and in that suspended instant, the entire trajectory of the evening, and perhaps several lives, hung in the balance. The crystal chandelier continued to cast its dancing shadows, the champagne bubbles continued to rise in forgotten glasses, but everything else had stopped. And then, with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, Sarah's fingers descended toward the keys, and the world held its breath for what was about to unfold. The moment Sarah's fingertips made contact with the ivory keys, the world around her seemed to dissolve. The opulent ballroom, the watching guests, even Vincent's smug expression, everything faded into a distant haze as memories came rushing back like a dam bursting open after years of careful containment. 25 years ago. She was 17 then, her name not Sarah but Sophia Chin-Williams, a name that once appeared on concert programs and music academy newsletters. The practice room at the Juilliard preparatory program was her second home, where she spent 8 hours a day perfecting her craft, her fingers dancing across keys with the kind of natural grace that made seasoned instructors stop in their tracks. Extraordinary, Professor Heinrich Zimmer had whispered to his colleague after hearing her audition. In 40 years of teaching, I've encountered perhaps 3 students with this level of raw talent. She doesn't just play music, she speaks it fluently. Professor Zimmer, the legendary maestro who had taught some of the world's greatest pianists, including a young man named Vincent Ashworth. Sophia had been his prize pupil, the one he privately called his greatest discovery. Under his guidance, she had mastered pieces that seasoned professionals struggled with, her interpretations so unique and emotionally powerful that they brought tears to the eyes of hardened critics. The memory of those golden days flooded through her now, the smell of rosin and old wood in the practice rooms, the weight of expectation and possibility, the dreams that seemed so achingly close she could taste them. She had been chosen for the International Young Artists Competition, the competition that could launch her career into the stratosphere. First place virtually guaranteed recording contracts, management deals, and a future as bright as the stage lights she longed to perform under. But then came the meeting. She could still remember every detail: the sterile conference room, the uncomfortable chairs, the way the light caught the dust motes floating in the air. 3 white men in expensive suits sat across from Professor Zimmer and herself, their expressions carefully neutral. Miss Chin-Williams, the head of the competition board had said, his voice carrying the kind of politeness that barely concealed disdain. Your talent is undeniable. However, we have concerns about the marketability of your image in today's classical music landscape. The words had hit her like physical blows. Marketability. Image. In today's landscape. Code words that everyone in the room understood perfectly, even if they were too cowardly to say what they really meant. What exactly are you suggesting? Professor Zimmer had demanded, his German accent thickening with barely controlled rage. We're suggesting, another board member had interjected smoothly, that perhaps Miss Chin-Williams might be more comfortable in other musical genres. Jazz, perhaps. Or contemporary. Venues where her particular background might be more appreciated. The humiliation of that moment still burned in her chest 25 years later. She had trained for classical music her entire life, had poured her soul into Bach and Chopin and Rachmaninoff, had earned her place at that table through pure talent and endless dedication. But to them, her skin color meant she would never truly belong in their pristine world of classical music. Professor Zimmer had fought for her, had threatened to withdraw from the competition entirely, had called colleagues and pulled strings. But the damage was done. Word spread quietly through the insular world of classical music. Doors that had been opening began to close. Opportunities dried up. Scholarships were mysteriously awarded to other candidates. Even her place at Juilliard became tenuous. The final blow had come from Vincent Ashworth himself, though he probably never knew it. She remembered watching from the wings as he performed her arrangement, yes, her arrangement, of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 at a student recital. It was a piece she had spent months perfecting, adding her own unique interpretive flourishes that elevated it beyond the standard performance. Professor Zimmer had praised it as revolutionary. But there was Vincent on stage, playing her interpretation note for note, gesture for gesture, claiming it as his own innovation. When she confronted Professor Zimmer about it, The old man had looked away in shame. "I gave him your notes," he admitted quietly. "The board. They insisted. They said Vincent needed material for his audition, that his career was too promising to risk. They said you would understand. That there would be other opportunities for you." But there hadn't been other opportunities. One by one, every door slammed shut. Her name was quietly removed from programs, her scholarship applications were rejected, and eventually, she was forced to drop out entirely. The classical music world had erased her as if she had never existed. The pain of those memories threatened to overwhelm her, but Sophia, forced herself to remain present. Her hands were still poised over the keys, though barely 3 seconds had passed since she'd sat down. The guests were still waiting, still expecting their entertainment. She thought of the years that followed, working as a waitress, a house cleaner, anything to survive while her dreams slowly died. She thought of the piano she'd been forced to sell, the sheet music she'd eventually thrown away because looking at it hurt too much. She thought of the nights she'd walked past concert halls, hearing the music drifting out into the street, knowing she should have been the one on that stage. But most of all, she thought of Vincent Ashworth's rise to fame, built partially on her stolen work, celebrated while she scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. The man who now stood beside her, expecting her humiliation, had unknowingly been part of the system that destroyed her life. Her fingers pressed down on the keys, and the first notes rang out clear and true. But these weren't the fumbling attempts of an amateur. These were the notes of someone who had never truly stopped being a pianist, no matter what life had taken from her. The first chord that emerged from the Steinway was not what anyone expected. Instead of the hesitant plinking of "Mary Had a Little Lamb," or the embarrassed fumbling Vincent had anticipated, a rich, complex harmony filled the ballroom with crystalline clarity. The sound was so pure, so perfectly executed, that several guests unconsciously straightened in surprise. But Vincent's reaction was far more dramatic. The color drained from his face as he recognized the opening measures, his confident smile freezing into something resembling horror. Those notes, he knew them intimately, because he had been working on them in secret for months. Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, launching into a piece that existed nowhere in published form, nowhere in any concert program, nowhere except in Vincent's private study and his most guarded ambitions. It was his masterwork. Echoes of Tomorrow, a composition he had been crafting for his upcoming Carnegie Hall anniversary concert, a piece he had told absolutely no one about. The melody soared through the ballroom, each phrase more breathtaking than the last. This wasn't just technical proficiency, this was artistry of the highest order. Sarah played with an emotional depth that made Vincent's own practice sessions seem like mechanical exercises. Where he had struggled to find the soul of the piece, she seemed to understand its very essence intuitively. The guests had fallen into stunned silence. Mrs. Pemberton's champagne glass hung forgotten in her hand, her mouth slightly open. The oil baron who had praised Vincent's $50,000 fee was now witnessing something that money couldn't buy, true genius unleashed. But how was this possible? Vincent's mind raced frantically. He had composed this piece entirely alone in his Manhattan penthouse, working on it only late at night when his assistant had gone home. The manuscript existed in just one place, locked in his personal safe. He hadn't even shared it with his manager or his recording company. So how could this woman, this maid, be playing it as if she had written it herself? Sarah moved into the piece's second movement, her interpretation adding layers of complexity that Vincent had never imagined. She took his composition and elevated it, finding emotional nuances and technical possibilities he had missed entirely. Her hands seemed to float across the keys, producing cascades of notes that built into thunderous crescendos before dissolving into whisper-soft passages that made the audience lean forward to catch every sound. Vincent watched in growing panic as she navigated passages that had taken him weeks to perfect. But more than that, she was improving upon his work. Where he had written straightforward melodic lines, she added subtle harmonic variations. Where he had composed standard rhythmic patterns, she introduced syncopations that made the music pulse with life. The third movement began, and Vincent felt his world tilting off its axis. She was playing variations he had never written, extensions of themes he had only dreamed of developing. It was as if she could see the complete architectural blueprint of the composition, while he had been working from rough sketches. "My God!" whispered a renowned music critic who happened to be among the guests. "This is extraordinary. Who is this woman?" Vincent wanted to scream that she was nobody, just a help, just a maid who had somehow stumbled upon his private work. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew they were lies. Nobody stumbled upon this level of musical understanding. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was a master musician at work. As Sarah transitioned into the fourth movement, memories began flickering at the edge of Vincent's consciousness. Professor Zimmer, years ago, speaking in hushed tones about his greatest student, a girl whose talent was so extraordinary it frightened him. "She understands music in ways that cannot be taught," the old maestro had said. "She doesn't just play compositions, she completes them, finds the missing pieces that even the composer didn't know existed." Vincent had been jealous of this mysterious prodigy, this student who had apparently surpassed even him in their teacher's estimation. He had pressed for details, but Professor Zimmer had grown evasive, mentioning only that the girl had been lost to the music world under tragic circumstances. Now, watching Sarah's fingers dance across the keys with supernatural skill, Vincent felt a cold recognition creeping through his chest. The way she played, the musical intelligence behind every note choice, the effortless technique. This was the level of artistry Professor Zimmer had described with such reverence and regret. Sarah reached the composition's climactic passage, a section that had nearly driven Vincent to madness with its technical demands. She attacked it fearlessly, her hands flying across the keyboard in patterns so complex they seemed to blur. But every note rang true, every phrase perfectly shaped, building to a crescendo that seemed to lift the very roof of the mansion. The final movement was Vincent's pride and joy, a delicate meditation that required the most subtle touch to execute properly. Sarah approached it with reverence, her playing becoming so gentle it seemed she was caressing each note into existence. The melody floated through the room like a prayer, touching something deep in the souls of everyone present. As the last notes faded into perfect silence, not a single person in the ballroom moved. The quiet stretched on, profound and absolute, as if the entire world was holding its breath in recognition of what they had just witnessed. Vincent stared at Sarah in complete shock, his mind reeling with the impossible reality before him. This wasn't just someone who had somehow learned his secret composition. This was someone who understood it better than he did, who had revealed layers of beauty in his own work that he had never suspected existed. The question that would haunt him for the rest of his life formed silently in his mind: just who was this woman? The applause, when it finally came, was unlike anything Vincent had ever heard in his illustrious career. It wasn't the polite clapping of high society, or even the enthusiastic appreciation of devoted fans. This was something primal, a thunderous, standing ovation born from witnessing something that transcended mere performance, and entered the realm of the miraculous. But Vincent barely heard it. He stood frozen beside the piano, his world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The confident smile that had been his trademark for decades had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of raw shock and growing horror. His mind raced back through the years, desperately trying to piece together fragments of memory that suddenly seemed crucial. Professor Zimmer's voice echoed in his head. "There was a student once. A girl whose gifts made even you look ordinary by comparison. She had something that cannot be taught, cannot be learned. She had the soul of music itself." Vincent had always dismissed these comments as the nostalgic ramblings of an old man, perhaps embellished by time and regret. Every teacher claimed to have discovered the greatest talent at some point. But now, watching Sarah gracefully acknowledge the thunderous applause with the poise of someone born for the stage, those words took on a terrifying new meaning. "Vincent!" Mrs. Pemberton appeared at his elbow, her voice breathless with excitement. "My God, where did you find her? She's absolutely incredible." "Find her?" Vincent wanted to laugh at the absurdity. He hadn't found her, She had been right here all along, invisible in plain sight, cleaning glasses and straightening cushions while he basked in applause that now felt hollow and undeserved. The way she played your composition, continued the oil baron, joining their conversation. I mean, I've heard you perform it in practice sessions, but she made it sound completely different. Better, if I'm being honest. Better. The word hit Vincent like a physical blow. His secret masterpiece, the composition he had planned to debut as the crowning achievement of his career, had just been performed by someone who understood it more deeply than he did. Someone who had revealed musical possibilities he hadn't even known existed. Across the room, he noticed the music critic frantically scribbling in a small notebook, his eyes still fixed on Sarah with an expression of awe. Other guests were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly calling friends and colleagues to describe what they had just witnessed. By tomorrow morning, word of this performance would spread through the classical music world like wildfire. But the worst realization was yet to come. As Vincent watched Sarah's quiet dignity in accepting the praise, more memories began to surface. Professor Zimmer's description of his lost prodigy. She had such grace, such natural stage presence. Even in practice, she commanded attention without trying. And her hands, they moved like water across the keys, finding music in places others couldn't even imagine. The description fit Sarah perfectly. But there was more. Fragments of conversations Vincent had forgotten, details that now seemed impossibly significant. The professor had mentioned his greatest student was mixed race, that she had been failed by the very system designed to nurture talent. He had spoken of betrayal, of doors closed by prejudice, of a promising career destroyed by forces beyond artistic merit. Vincent's legs felt weak as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just any talented amateur who had somehow learned his composition. This was her, the legendary student Professor Zimmer had mourned for years, the one whose talent had haunted the old maestro's dreams. She learned from Heinrich Zimmer. Vincent whispered, barely aware he was speaking aloud. What did you say? Mrs. Pemberton leaned closer. Nothing, Vincent stammered, but his mind was spiraling deeper into panic. If Sarah was indeed Professor Zimmer's lost prodigy, then everything Vincent believed about his own talent was built on a foundation of lies. He remembered now, some of his most celebrated early pieces had been inspired by exercises and arrangements the professor had shown him, compositions that came from his work with other students. How much of his success was truly his own? How much had been borrowed, adapted, or outright stolen from the work of the woman who now stood before him, accepting praise that should have been hers decades ago? The irony was crushing. He had invited her to play as a joke, expecting her humiliation to provide entertainment for his audience. Instead, she had delivered a performance that exposed him as the pretender. In trying to elevate himself at her expense, he had inadvertently revealed the true hierarchy of talent, and he was not at the top. Whispers began to circulate around the room. Vincent caught fragments of conversation. Where has she been hiding? How is this possible? Did you see Vincent's face? I've never heard anything like that in my life. Each whispered comment felt like another nail in the coffin of his reputation. He had built his career on being untouchable, the undisputed master of his craft. But in the space of 10 minutes, a woman he had dismissed as nothing more than hired help had shattered that illusion completely. The most devastating part was the growing realization that this moment would define the rest of his life. Every future performance would be compared to what people had witnessed tonight. Every review would reference the evening when a maid had outplayed the great Vincent Ashworth using his own composition. His legacy, carefully constructed over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. And Sarah, Sophia, whoever she truly was, stood at the center of it all with quiet dignity, finally reclaiming the recognition that had been stolen from her so many years ago. The applause gradually subsided, but the electric energy in the room remained palpable. Guests clustered around Sarah, their earlier dismissive glances replaced by eager curiosity and newfound respect. Mrs. Pemberton pushed through the crowd, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light as she reached for Sarah's hands. My dear, that was absolutely magnificent, she gushed, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. "I must know, where did you study? Who trained you to play like that?" Sarah looked around the circle of expectant faces, her eyes eventually settling on Vincent, who stood pale and shaken at the edge of the crowd. For a moment something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the performance they had both just lived through, though from vastly different perspectives. "Please," called out the music critic, his notebook still in hand. "You must tell us your story. That performance was..." "It was unlike anything I've witnessed in 30 years of reviewing concerts." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered guests. Sarah took a deep breath, her composure steady despite the intensity of dozens of pairs of eyes fixed upon her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed truth. "My name is not Sarah," she began quietly. "It's Sophia Chin-Williams. And 25 years ago, I was a student at the Juilliard Preparatory Program, training under Professor Heinrich Zimmer." Vincent's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Several guests glanced at him curiously, noting his stricken expression, but their attention quickly returned to Sophia as she continued. "I was 17 when I was selected for the International Young Artists Competition, the same competition that launched many careers you would recognize today." Her eyes found Vincent again, and he flinched under her steady gaze. "I had been preparing for months, working on pieces that Professor Zimmer said showcased my unique interpretive abilities." Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward, captivated. "What happened? Why haven't we heard of you before tonight?" Sophia's smile was sad but not bitter. "Because 3 days before the competition, I was called into a meeting with the board of directors. They explained to me that while my talent was undeniable, they had concerns about my marketability. They suggested I might be more comfortable pursuing jazz or contemporary music, genres where, as they put it, my particular background would be more appreciated." A horrified silence fell over the group. The oil baron's face darkened with understanding, while Mrs. Pemberton's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "They actually said that to a 17-year-old girl?" demanded a woman Vincent recognized as a prominent arts patron. "Not in so many words," Sophia replied with quiet dignity. "They were far too sophisticated for such crude language. But the message was clear. In their vision of classical music, there was no place for someone who looked like me, regardless of ability." The critic scribbled furiously, recognizing a story that would send shockwaves through the music world. "And Professor Zimmer? What did he do?" "He fought for me," Sophia said, her voice warming slightly. "Heinrich was furious. He threatened to withdraw from the competition entirely, called everyone he knew. But the damage was done. Word spread quietly through the classical music community. Doors that had been opening began to close. Scholarships disappeared. Even my place at Juilliard became complicated." Vincent felt sick to his stomach as she spoke, because he remembered those days differently. He remembered them as the period when his own star had begun to rise, when opportunities had seemed to multiply around him, when Professor Zimmer had suddenly begun sharing new arrangements and interpretive approaches that elevated Vincent's performances to new heights. "I was forced to drop out," Sophia continued, her voice steady despite the pain of the memories. "I sold my piano to pay rent, threw away my sheet music because looking at it hurt too much. I told myself I would find another way back to music, but years passed. I took whatever jobs I could find, waitressing, cleaning, anything to survive. But you never stopped playing," observed the critic shrewdly. Sophia shook her head. "I couldn't afford to. Late at night, I would find pianos, in hotel lobbies, church basements, anywhere I could practice without being noticed. I told myself I was just keeping my fingers nimble, but really, music was all I had left of who I used to be." "And the piece you just performed?" asked Mrs. Pemberton. "How did you know it?" Vincent's blood ran cold, knowing the answer before Sophia spoke. "Because I wrote it," she said simply. 25 years ago, as part of my competition preparation. I called it Dreams Deferred, a reflection on potential that might never be realized. Professor Zimmer said it was the most mature composition he had ever seen from someone my age. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. All eyes turned to Vincent, who looked as if he might collapse. The composition he had planned to debut as his masterwork, the piece that was supposed to cement his legacy, belonged to the woman standing before them. "I gave the only copy to Professor Zimmer before I was forced to leave," Sophia continued. "I thought it would die with my dreams. I never imagined I would hear it again, let alone performed by someone else." The accusation hung unspoken in the air, but everyone understood its implications. Vincent's theft wasn't just of a composition, it was of a young woman's future, her identity, her very soul made manifest in music. The silence that followed Sophia's revelation was deafening. Vincent stood frozen, his face ashen as the full weight of his exposure settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Every eye in the room bore into him with a mixture of disgust, disappointment, and dawning understanding. The great Vincent Ashworth, celebrated virtuoso, cultural icon, the man they had paid fortunes to hear, was nothing more than a fraud built on stolen dreams. Mrs. Pemberton was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling with barely controlled outrage. "Vincent," she said, his name falling from her lips like a curse. "Is this true?" Vincent opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he hadn't known? That it was Professor Zimmer's fault for giving him the composition? That the music world's systemic racism wasn't his responsibility? Every excuse that formed in his mind sounded pathetic even to him. "Answer her," demanded the oil baron, his earlier admiration transformed into cold contempt. "Did you steal this woman's work?" Professor Zimmer gave me," Vincent stammered, but his voice cracked under the weight of 40 pairs of accusatory stares. The music critic stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Ashworth, I've been documenting classical music careers for 3 decades. If what Ms. Chen Williams says is true, this isn't just plagiarism. This is cultural theft on a scale that will redefine how we understand artistic integrity in our industry. It's worse than that," said the arts patron, her voice sharp with anger. "A 17-year-old girl was denied her future because of the color of her skin, and this man profited from her destruction. This isn't just about music, this is about justice." Vincent felt the room closing in around him. These people, his patrons, his admirers, the elite society that had elevated him to godlike status, were turning on him with the ruthless efficiency of wolves sensing weakness. The same social dynamics that had once protected him from scrutiny were now ensuring his complete annihilation. "My God, Vincent!" whispered Mrs. Pemberton, genuine hurt in her voice. "How many times have I praised your innovative interpretations? How many of your so-called original compositions were stolen from students who couldn't fight back?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Vincent realized with horror that his entire catalogue would now be scrutinized, every piece examined for signs of theft. His legacy wasn't just crumbling, it was being systematically demolished, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Sophia stood with quiet dignity as guests approached her with apologies, business cards, and promises of restored opportunities. The arts patron pressed her card into Sophia's hand, insisting on funding a comeback concert. The critic was already on his phone, likely calling his editor with the story of the century. "Ms. Chen Williams," called out a woman Vincent recognized as a prominent recording executive. "I would be honored to discuss a recording contract with you. The world needs to hear your gift. And I know several concert halls that would kill for an exclusive performance," added another guest, pushing forward eagerly. Vincent watched in mounting horror as Sophia was literally surrounded by the same people who had just been celebrating him 30 minutes earlier. The speed of their abandonment was breathtaking, but he understood the cruel logic. In a world built on reputation and public image, being associated with him now would be toxic, while being connected to Sophia's redemption story would be invaluable. "I think," Mrs. Pemberton announced loudly, her voice cutting through the excited conversations, "that Vincent should leave immediately." The room fell silent again, all eyes turning to Vincent with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. He looked desperately around the ballroom that had been his kingdom just moments before, searching for even one friendly face, one person who might offer support or understanding. He found none. But Mrs. Pemberton, he began desperately. Surely we can discuss. There's nothing to discuss, she replied coldly. Security will escort you out. And Vincent? She paused, making sure everyone could hear her next words. You're blacklisted from every event I host or influence. I suspect you'll find that sentiment widely shared among our circle. As if summoned by her words, 2 security guards appeared at Vincent's elbows. His humiliation was complete. He was being physically removed from the same venue where he had been the guest of honor just an hour earlier. As they led him toward the exit, Vincent caught one final glimpse of Sophia. She wasn't celebrating his downfall or reveling in her vindication. Instead, she was speaking quietly with the music critic, her expression focused and professional, already moving forward with the dignity and grace that had been her hallmark even in servitude. The last thing Vincent heard before the ballroom doors closed behind him was thunderous applause, not for him this time, but for the woman whose dreams he had stolen and who had finally, after 25 years of silence, reclaimed her rightful place as the genius she had always been. Outside in the cold night air, Vincent Ashworth, disgraced pianist, exposed fraud, fallen idol, walked alone toward an uncertain future, while behind him, Sophia Chin-Williams stepped back into the spotlight that should never have been taken from her.